I want to start by asking you, Gideon Rachman, sitting where you are in Hong Kong at this moment, about your broad sense of the G20 summit in India in the way that is shaping up from your perspective. Prime Minister Modi and his government have invested a lot of energy, effort in trying to make this a grand success. Some big leaders have decided that they're not coming. What's your sense of how we're shaping up and building into this big G20 summit?
Well, clearly it's a big moment for India and for Modi, but I think there's been no doubt for some time that the G20 as an organization is in trouble. The Russia war on Ukraine has opened up a huge split inside it. You know, following the Indonesians who had this particular hot potato handed to them last year, they were wondering right up to the last moment what they would do about Putin, whether he would come, what kind of statement that could be made. And they just about got through it. And so, although I think it's both an opportunity but also an enormous challenge for India, because these divisions are opening up between the G20 nations. We're going back to something that looks more like a Cold War, not just the adversarial relationship between the West and Russia, but also an increasingly adversarial relationship between the US and China. And now this decision by Xi Jinping not to come to Delhi. And obviously he's a big miss. They're one of the two, if you like, superpowers of the current system. So the chances of getting a kind of global consensus on the kinds of issues that the G20 is meant to deal with, the economic issues, climate, debt restructuring, all that kind of thing, I think do recede a little bit. Although, of course, Xi is sending his prime minister, so it may be that China will still play ball to some extent.
Martin Wolf, in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, the G20 emerged as the premier global platform for decision-making, as it included not just the G7 countries, but also the voice of the global south. In the tensions that are emerging now, do you think the G20 is becoming less relevant in the future, or do you think this is just a temporary blip from which the G20 might recover?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Gideon said, so I won't go over that, about where we are now. I think the contrast you point to between where we were in late 2008 and early 2009, when there were two summits in short order, and which really shaped the global response to the financial crisis and put the G20 at the head of government level on the map. This was a sort of transformative, positive moment for those of us who hoped for a move to greater global governance. And the G20 was remarkably successful, notably with the London meeting in early 2009, April, if I remember correctly. And what we've seen since then is the G20's development reflects the development in geopolitics and geoeconomics, and most notably so, I would say, since the election of Donald Trump, the decisive shift to the United States, the clear move of Xi Jinping's China in a more inward-looking and even more authoritarian direction, the Ukraine, the impact of COVID, which was dramatic, of course, on the world economy and world politics, and finally the war. And the result is now that the G20, in the context of its history, is obviously sort of a shell. This is in no way the fault of the Indian government, the Indian Prime Minister, who's clearly doing his best. But the reality is the G20 now looks like, cats in a bag. They just don't agree on anything. And the differences among them are very wide-ranging. They cover economics and politics over and above the traditional North-South differences and differences of opinion over how to handle key issues like climate. So making the G20 work is almost impossible, but that's a reflection of where the world is.
Gideon Rachman, everyone has his own take on why Xi Jinping decided to skip the Delhi summit. He went to Johannesburg for BRICS. He is going to the US possibly, and Putin will be coming to China. Despite all of this, he's announced he's not coming to Delhi. Why do you think Xi, at this point, took this decision?
Well, I mean, the simplest explanation might simply be that it's a tit for tat, because Modi did not go to the Belt and Road Summit that Xi held, so maybe he's angry about that. And
But
he
India's
says,
never
well,
been part of the BRI. India's always opposed the BRI, and China has been a very active participant in the G20 before this.
Yeah, no, so clearly it's a deliberate snub. The question is whether the snub is just a tit for tat and that he wants to make a limited point about the BRI, or whether there's a bigger sense that he wants to snub India, or that he's uncomfortable with the G20. I suspect that it's a bit of both of the latter, that clearly Indian-Chinese tensions have been high ever since the incidents on the Himalayas, the killing on both sides. They are still capable of meeting in contexts such as the BRICS, but it's not an easy relationship. Maybe Xi doesn't feel comfortable being, India's guest in Delhi, or maybe he doesn't want to engage with the Americans at this particular point, because the last time that Biden spoke to Xi one-on-one was in the Bali G20 meeting. The Americans have been saying for a while that they want to get back to Bali. There's been a lot of troubles in the US-Chinese relationship, the balloon incident, cancelled meetings, etc., etc. So the Chinese may feel that this is a big prize, or a big moment anyway, when Xi and Biden re-engage, and they're not ready for it yet. So, but for whatever reason, it's very, very pointed that he's not coming. And I think it does make a point about, I was looking at the interview that you did with the Prime Minister Modi, where he talked about, the hope that the G20 could become the voice of the global South. But it does raise the question of, is there a coherent global South? If China and India are really at loggerheads or not able to coordinate a position, then is there a global South ready to represent in this context?